Hello everyone, and here are the details of today's video. Japan's recent attempt to cool tensions with China was received in Beijing not with gratitude or relief, but with a deliberate and unmistakable refusal. To outside observers, this reaction may appear rigid or unyielding. But through the lens of East Asian geopolitics, a region defined by deep historical memory and accelerating strategic rivalry, China's response reveals something far more profound, a belief that Japan's conciliatory rhetoric does not correspond to its geopolitical behavior. In the carefully choreographed world of diplomacy, language is meant to soothe, reassure, and signal restraint. Yet for China, words have become increasingly insufficient against a backdrop of actions that suggest a very different trajectory. Japan has entered a period of dramatic strategic transformation. It is expanding its defense budget to levels unseen since World War II, acquiring long-range strike capabilities and investing in military doctrine that blurs the line between defensive posture and offensive potential. Beijing does not interpret these shifts as neutral or benign. They represent, in China's view, a fundamental recalibration of Japanese power. This disconnect between rhetoric and action is the core of China's rejection. When Japan speaks of harmony, Beijing looks instead at missile deployments. When Tokyo calls for stability, Beijing sees its deeper integration into the US-led Indo-Pacific framework. When Japan promises de-escalation, China observes a nation weaving itself into an increasingly cohesive American security architecture designed explicitly to contain China's rise. Thus, what Japan presents as a gesture of goodwill appears to China as a cover for a broader strategic alignment. The reaction from Beijing is therefore not emotional but structural. China perceives that the regional order is being reshaped around it, and that Japan is playing a pivotal role in this reshaping. A polite message of de-escalation does nothing to change this underlying reality. From China's vantage point, Japan's outreach is an attempt to manage optics rather than shift policy, diplomatic sugarcoating over strategic steel. There is also an implicit message embedded in China's refusal. Trust cannot be restored through language alone. Relations between the two nations carry decades of unresolved historical tension. Collective memory in China still frames Japan as an unpredictable actor whose military resurgence must be watched with caution. Even as generations pass, these narratives persist in the political consciousness. For Beijing, any significant Japanese gesture must therefore be proven not in words but in sustained behavior over time. Furthermore, China's rejection reflects a broader strategic logic. The region is entering an era of sharper power competition, and ambiguity is no longer acceptable. Beijing demands clarity. Either Japan seeks genuine partnership in a multipolar Asia, or it remains firmly embedded in Washington's geopolitical vision. Statements of harmony that do not alter Japan's security commitments are thus dismissed as insincere. In rejecting Japan's gesture, China is not merely rebuking Tokyo, it is articulating a deeper regional principle. Stability requires alignment between language and action, and no diplomatic overture can substitute for structural trust. The gap between Japan's words and its policies is, in China's eyes, too wide to ignore. No diplomatic phrase, however carefully crafted, can escape the weight of history in East Asia. When Beijing rejected Japan's attempt to cool tensions, the rejection echoed far beyond the politics of the moment. It reflected a deeper psychological landscape shaped by collective memory, wartime trauma, and the unresolved moral ledger between two nations whose past continues to intrude upon their present. In the Chinese view, Japan's words can only be interpreted through this long, unresolved historical context. For China, the memory of Japan's wartime aggression is not a distant tragedy buried in textbooks. It is a living narrative woven into national identity. The scars of the Sino-Japanese War, the devastation of Nanjing, and decades of imperial occupation remain vividly embedded in the Chinese collective consciousness. These memories are not simply emotional residues, they form a strategic lens through which Beijing evaluates Japanese intentions. Any shift in Japan's military posture triggers historical reflexes, activating deep caution, even mistrust. Against this backdrop, Japan's conciliatory language appears insufficient. China believes that genuine easing of tensions requires more than diplomatic gestures. It requires an acknowledgement of the past that is not merely symbolic but substantive. Yet, from Beijing's perspective, Japan has not fully addressed this historical burden. School curricula, political visits to contested historical sites, and perceived ambivalence in Japanese leadership continue to reinforce the perception that Tokyo has not fully reckoned with its past. As long as these unresolved narratives persist, China views any Japanese overture as incomplete and potentially insincere. But history alone does not explain the present mistrust. What intensifies China's skepticism is the way contemporary Japanese policy appears to mirror historical patterns. The rapid expansion of Japan's defense capabilities, its revival of long-range strike ambitions, and its deepening integration into U.S. strategic frameworks all evoke echoes of an earlier era, an era in which Japan sought military dominance in the region. While today's Japan is a democratic nation with a pacifist constitution, Beijing sees parallels in the structural dynamic. A Japan once again aligning itself with a great power to project influence across Asia. This fusion of historical memory and modern geopolitics creates a potent psychological barrier. Even if Japan sincerely wishes to reduce tensions, China perceives the gesture as decoupled from the structural forces shaping Tokyo's strategy. Words can signal intent, but China has learned from history to trust patterns, not promises. Furthermore, both nations cultivate national identities that depend on historical narratives. In China, wartime suffering is central to its self-presentation as a nation that has risen from humiliation to strength. In Japan, post-war pacifism in its more recent reinterpretation forms the foundation of its strategic transformation. These identities clash not only at the diplomatic level, but at the symbolic one. When Japan signals calm, China sees ambiguity. When Japan prepares militarily, China sees history repeating itself. Thus, China's refusal to accept Japan's overture is not simply a diplomatic reaction. It is the result of an emotional, cultural, and geopolitical inheritance that cannot be brushed aside by a single statement of goodwill. Until both nations negotiate not only their present interests but their historical narratives, gestures of de-escalation will remain fragile, easily overshadowed by the shadows of the past. If history shapes emotion, strategy shapes perception, and in the eyes of Beijing, Japan's evolving military posture speaks far louder than any diplomatic reassurance. What China sees today is not a Japan offering calm, but a Japan undergoing the most significant rearmament in its post-war history, an evolution that fundamentally alters the regional balance of power and renders any verbal gesture of easing tensions hollow. Over the past several years, Japan has embarked on a profound transformation of its defense doctrine. It is committed to doubling its military spending, acquiring long-range strike capabilities, restructuring its missile forces, expanding cyber and space operations, and redefining its self-defense forces into something that increasingly resembles a full-fledged military power. In Tokyo, these moves are framed as necessary responses to a deteriorating security environment. But in Beijing, they are interpreted through an entirely different lens, a Japan that is shedding its post-war constraints and preparing to assume a frontline role in countering China's rise. This shift sits at the heart of China's rejection. From Beijing's perspective, Japan's outreach for calm occurs simultaneously with actions that heighten the potential for confrontation. The contradiction is not subtle. While Japan speaks of dialogue, it integrates itself more deeply into the U.S.-led Indo-Pacific strategy, a strategy China views as the modern expression of containment. Washington's Indo-Pacific framework relies heavily on Japan's geographic positioning, technological capacity, and political will. Japan has become the anchor of America's regional network, hosting advanced missile defense systems, joint command structures, and increasingly interoperable naval forces. To China, this is not defensive alignment, it is offensive architecture. It suggests that Japan is no longer merely protecting its interests, but enabling a broader strategic encirclement of China. Thus, Beijing interprets every Japanese defense initiative as part of a larger design. When Japan announces missile purchases, China sees preparation for preemptive capability. When Japan strengthens ties with South Korea and Australia, China sees coalition building. When Japan criticizes China's actions in Taiwan or the South China Sea, Beijing sees political signaling that aligns entirely with U.S. preferences. This is why China dismisses Japan's attempt to cool tensions. Actions speak a dialect of power that cannot be softened by diplomatic vocabulary. To Beijing, Tokyo is constructing a regional order built not on coexistence, but on deterrence, and perhaps, if escalation were to occur, confrontation. There is also a psychological dimension. China's leadership views Japan's remilitarization not in isolation, but as part of a historical continuum. Even if today's Japan is legally constrained and democratically governed, the structural logic of military expansion evokes memories of an earlier era in which Japan used industrial strength and foreign alliances to project power across Asia. Beijing does not equate the two eras, but it perceives the rhyme, and the rhyme is enough to trigger caution. The result is a strategic stalemate. Japan believes its rearmament is defensive. China believes it is offensive. Japan believes dialogue can coexist with deterrence. China believes dialogue requires restraint. The two narratives do not intersect, and so China rejects Japan's overture, not out of hostility, but out of a deeply rooted assessment that Tokyo's words are incompatible with Tokyo's trajectory. Until Japan's military strategy aligns with its diplomatic language, China will treat any gesture of ease as a contradiction rather than a commitment. Economic interdependence is often described as a stabilizing force, a web of shared interests strong enough to restrain geopolitical rivalry. Yet in the case of China and Japan, this interdependence has produced something far more complex, a relationship in which economic cooperation coexists with deep strategic suspicion. When Tokyo spoke of cooling tensions, Beijing measured those words against a broader economic reality. A Japan benefiting from China's markets while simultaneously participating in policies designed to constrain China's technological ascent. Japan is one of China's most important trading partners, and China remains indispensable to Japanese exporters, manufacturers, and supply chains. Automobiles, electronics, machinery, and high-end industrial components flow across the East China Sea with seamless regularity. In theory, such mutual dependence should provide a foundation for trust, but in practice, it has become a source of strain. China sees Japan's integration into U.S.-led restrictions on advanced technology, notably semiconductors and lithography equipment, as an unmistakable signal. Tokyo's economic policy is no longer neutral, but aligned with Washington's broader strategic objectives. To Beijing, this shift strikes at the heart of national development. China's modernization relies heavily on access to advanced technology, and Washington's export controls aim precisely at slowing that ascent. When Japan agreed to join these controls, China interpreted it not as a commercial decision, but as a geopolitical choice. It believes Tokyo has positioned itself as a key node in the U.S. strategy of technological containment. This is why diplomatic gestures fail. Japan's words of de-escalation cannot outweigh the structural pressures created by economic policy. Every time Japan limits technology exports, China sees the gap between rhetoric and reality widen. Tokyo may insist that these actions are defensive and rules-based, but Beijing perceives them as targeted constraints, acts of economic statecraft dressed in bureaucratic language. Yet the tension runs even deeper. China also recognizes that Japan's economic anxieties are growing amid demographic decline, shrinking labor supply, and domestic stagnation. Japan increasingly relies on stable trade with China to sustain growth. This dependency, paradoxically, heightens China's distrust. Beijing fears Tokyo may use diplomatic overtures to secure economic benefits while continuing to align militarily with the United States. The core dilemma is therefore structural. China and Japan are locked in a dual reality. Cooperation is necessary for prosperity, yet competition defines their strategic orientation. Economic ties grow, but trust does not. Supply chains integrate, but security perceptions harden. And in this context, Beijing views economic interdependence not as an assurance of peace, but as a vulnerability that Japan may exploit within a broader U.S.-led framework. Thus, when Japan extends a verbal gesture of calm, China hears something closer to a tactical maneuver useful for stability, but insufficient to alter the deeper strategic logic. For Beijing, genuine easing of tensions requires a coherence between words and policies, military restraint, technological neutrality, and a foreign policy less tethered to American objectives. Until these elements align, economic interdependence will remain a paradox, a force binding China and Japan together while simultaneously amplifying the mistrust that keeps them apart. The tension between China and Japan is not merely a bilateral issue, it is a fault line running through the entire architecture of East Asian security. Beijing's refusal to accept Tokyo's gesture of de-escalation underscores the fragility of a region caught between historical grievance, strategic realignment, and intensifying great power competition. The question is no longer why China rejected Japan's overture, but what this rejection signals for the broader future of stability in Asia. East Asia today is a paradoxical landscape. It is home to some of the deepest economic integration in the world, yet simultaneously hosts some of its most volatile territorial and political disputes. The China-Japan relationship embodies this paradox. Their economies are intertwined, but their strategic visions diverge sharply. Japan fears a China ascendant and unrestrained. China fears a Japan remilitarized and aligned with U.S. containment. Each interprets the other's moves through the most pessimistic lens. This dynamic creates a dangerous structural trap. Even when intentions are peaceful, perceptions become threatening. And perceptions, not intentions, shape the calculus of deterrence. If the current trajectory continues, East Asia risks drifting toward a more brittle and polarized order. Japan will deepen its integration with the United States, accelerating its military normalization. China will expand its regional influence while hardening its posture in the East China Sea and Taiwan Strait. The risk is not imminent war, but chronic instability, an environment where miscalculation becomes increasingly plausible. Yet this future is not predetermined. Stability in East Asia will depend on whether China and Japan can construct a new strategic framework that moves beyond old narratives and reactionary fear. Such a framework would require recognition of mutual economic dependence as a stabilizing anchor, transparent communication on military posture and red lines, regional security mechanism not fully dominated by any single power, political courage to address unresolved historical wounds. Most critically, both nations must accept that their futures are interlinked. Neither can flourish in an environment of perpetual suspicion. China's rejection of Japan's conciliatory gesture should be understood not as a closing of the door, but as a reminder. Dialogue must be grounded in structural trust, not symbolic language. The real work of peace in East Asia lies not in declarations, but in aligning actions with aspirations.